to the transportation seminar at Portland State University. My name is Wang. By pure coincidence, today I am both the host and the speaker and the solo host. Dr. Monsieur will not be here. So because of that, for those of you that ask questions in class, I encourage all of you to do, you probably want to make sure that to verify that I got your question, because there will be nobody that keep track of that. Or you can just write a short note to say either you asked your question or actually rewrite your question, and then leave when you exit from the seminar. Okay, with that logistic, I don't know whether I would need to reintroduce myself, but for the sake of those that have not been to the seminar before, my name is Wang. I'm an assistant professor at the Toulan School of Urban Study and Planning, of course at Portland State University. So, and my topic for today is the work that we just start to wrapping up on trying to develop and design and develop a new performance measure we call Transportation Cost Index. And with that, I will just start. So in terms of the topic, it's a rather long one. We're trying to develop a new performance measure largely under the umbrella of accessibility measure. For those of you that are familiar with the terminology, you probably have some idea what they are, but I will get into that in a little bit. And specifically, we're trying to track both the time and monetary cost of transportation, particularly for households, as a new accessibility measure. This is a collaborative work with my colleague, also at Toulan School at Urban Study and Planning, Professor Jenny Liu, and two graduate students help with the work. Huaji Yang is here today, and Wei Shi, they're both PhD students at the Urban Study program at Portland State. And we have two other collaborators, Bud Rafe and Brian Greger. They came out and essentially piloted the original concept of TCI. We'll mention that in a little bit. They also served in our technical advisory committee for our project. So their guidance and help has been invaluable in this work. For the outline, I will cover essentially those in sequence, given that for those that have some idea what accessibility measures are, you probably know that it's now a rather crowded field. So for any endeavor to design and develop a new accessibility measure, there probably requires some justification. And from there, I will talk about the Transportation Cost Index, the idea, and how it's being currently implemented, two implementation that we have done so far. And then I will go into explore or show you some application and demonstration for the Transportation Cost Index, and then we'll conclude with some ongoing and future work, as well as some resources for those of you that are interested to know more about the project. For those of you that have saw or have seen my webinar last October, I have to apologize that you will probably find some of the slides very familiar, as we reuse some of those. But we do include some new material, the work that's just finished rather recently. So there is largely a shift in the paradigm, so you can use the word, from the focus on mobility to accessibility in both transportation planning and engineering in the last probably a few decades. The mobility focus largely is a concept. Mobility concept is a concept that to measure how we can move people and goods from point A to point B as quickly as possible. On the other hand, the accessibility concept is a concept that measuring how easy households, people, individuals at different location, either location at point A or either at point B, how easy they can access to the activities, to the destinations they desire. So to improve mobility, it's almost kind of always leads to you want to improve, to reduce congestion, you want to add new capacity. That generally is what leads us to, I'm pretty sure that's an exaggerated, photoshopped picture, but I hope it get a point across. And on the other hand, to improve accessibility, we can certainly still improve mobility, but on the other hand, we can also improve accessibility by reconfiguration, by better planning of land use, so that people can easily get to the activity, get to the destination they want to, instead of have to travel long distance at very high speed. Okay, so that is basically a shift of mindset there. And given that shift, there is certainly needs for accessibility measure that essentially will help us have some gauge of how we are doing in terms of the accessibility measure. Essentially, use accessibility measure as performance measure for again, accessibility, right? So for accessibility measure, they could be used as a supplement or replacement of mobility measure, such as commonly used level surveys, travel delay, or congestion. As federal legislation since MAP 21 has put a lot more focus on performance measure or incorporate performance measure in transportation planning and operation, there is certainly a lot more focus on trying to develop and trying to document and catalog those accessibility measures. And here in Oregon, that we have the state legislation essentially passed a Oregon Jobs and Transportation Act, essentially mandate Oregon DOT to use the list cost planning process that essentially consider both transportation and land use strategy in evaluate to reach a set of goals, including the economic vitality, improve safety and sustainability, a long list of goals. And for that, certainly Oregon, ODOT, or for that matter, other public agency will have to utilize or use accessibility measures to gauge how they are doing in terms of assess both land use and transportation strategies, not single-minded focus on transportation or mobility idea. Okay, so. And of course, as I already mentioned, the accessibility measure is a very crowded field. This here is just a few examples of that document or designed new accessibility measures. Susan Handy and Deb Nimer's work in 1997 essentially summarized some of the common accessibility measures then, and Guer and Van Vee in 2004 essentially create a topology of classify different accessibility measures and how they may be used in plan-making process, policy-making process. NCHRP essentially churn out a long list of report that largely aim for transportation professionals to help guide them in their selection and application of performance measures, but a lot of them are actually accessibility measures. So given that we already have a long list, why we want to essentially take this endeavor of design a new one? Why can't we just either refine or actually directly use existing measures? For that, I want to essentially quickly go through a few categories of performance measure, in particularly accessibility measure, that essentially looking at their pros and cons, and then whether there are gaps that in those measures that we're trying to fill in our design for a new performance measure. The first category we want to look at is so-called market potential measures. An example is the employment accessible within 30 minutes by public transit during AM peak. The map is an example that I took from Accessibility Observatory at University of Minnesota. That again showed that exactly that metric, that measure for Minneapolis. Okay, so the advantage of such a measure is certainly it's very clear. It's very easy to interpret and understand. Pretty much everyone looking at this map know what it measures.
Actually, I can't figure it out. What's the legend?
What's the legend? Those are number of employment within that 30-minute threshold. Okay, so basically, even though the color is a bit hard to exactly pin down what is what, but the spatial distribution showing here is very easy to discern. Okay, so sure. But the limitation is that it is so-called opportunity. Here is the number of employment. And modes, here we focus on public transit, and time of day is during the AM peak hour, and time budget specific. Here we use the 30-minute threshold. So if you're interested in another set of opportunities, such as maybe shopping, restaurant, or parks, then you will need to create another map, do another calculation to calculate what's the accessibility measure for that opportunity. Similarly, for any other change, if you want to look at bike, or you want to look at a different time of day, or even just a different time budget window. Why it's 30 minutes, why it's not 20 or 45 minutes. Okay, so that is that. For that, it kind of create a comprehensive measure. You will require to go through a large number of similar measures. Another category, a second category of accessibility measure is this utility-based measure. Essentially, the log sum from the discrete choice model in a travel demand modeling system. For those of you that are familiar with the mode choice model, you probably already get the idea that this is a very elegant and composite measure, essentially capture all the modes. Ideally, it will not just for any single mode, to capture the accessibility measure for all modes at a geography largely at the TAZ level. And it's also possible to derive other metric from the log sum measure, in particular the so-called user benefit across different scenarios. So if we have two different sets of policies we want to evaluate, we can essentially use the log sum measure to compare which one is better. Use this log sum measure. Okay. The downside, of course, or the limitation is it's pretty hard to interpret by looking at the log sum measure itself. The relative magnitude is relatively easy, and the higher it generally is, the better. But what does it measure? Even though I'm teaching travel demand modeling, I will have to struggle or fumble to explain the concept to a lay person of travel demand modeling. Okay, and it's impossible to utilize a log sum measure to compare across different time, different regions, because the travel demand model will have a different parameter, a different specification. Essentially make it infeasible to use log sum measures to do benchmarking. You cannot compare the log sum across 2 different years or across 2 different regions. And the third category is the generalized cost indicator. This is kind of interesting because we are getting, for transportation cost index, we are getting into measuring the transportation cost as well, so we particularly include this category. Although it's not exactly an accessibility measure per se. What it measures is measured per distance, generalized cost for motorized trips. Here is an example by Koopmans in their paper that demonstrate how they measure the cost, the generalized costs for example, different location, rather at Randstand and Leatherland or outside Randstand at different time of day, but different purpose and different travel distance. I say it's not a performance measure, accessibility measure per se, because it ignores the land use component. It only primarily focus on the transportation side, and its modes and time of day specific. You can only looking at the driving mode, in this case motorized trips. And it's also kind of, you can only looking at one specific travel time at one travel time period. And of course, the advantage is it's pretty easy to interpret and understand, and we'll be able to use to monitor trends and compare scenarios. Okay. And the last category or last example of accessibility measure is the Housing plus Transportation Affordability Index by Center of Neighborhood Technology. The idea is to track the out-of-pocket monetary cost of transportation for households, and then add those costs to the housing cost as a location efficiency measure, given that housing and transportation pretty much is more than half of the household expenditure. It makes sense when looking at where households are and then the cost for different locations, or so-called location efficiency. It makes sense to combine those 2 costs. The limitation, though, is that they ignore the time costs. They essentially ignore how long you will have to, say, commute from where you are. Or they also does not track any other modes beyond auto and transit. Okay, so the only model whether at a specific location what percentage of the households are driving versus using transit, and then for those drive, how much do they drive, maybe in VMT. Okay, so which means that they essentially does not track the performance of a major part of performance of the transportation system. Essentially, how long it takes for people to travel, whether how congested the highway or the arterial will be, and that essentially will be a major limitation, given that probably for example, low-income household live in a not very accessible location, even though they only pay $2.50 for a ride, but a 20-minute ride is very different than an hour ride. Okay, so that should reflect it. We argue that should reflect it in the transportation costs. And after going through all those category of accessibility measure, here is our essentially wish list for our yet another performance measure. We hope this new performance measure will be a comprehensive measure, be able to present an overall picture of transportation and land use, essentially a accessibility measure that captures all modes, not just driving or any single or a few of the modes, but pretty much all the major multimodal modes. And we'll be able to fill gaps in the policy area that's not yet adequately addressed or covered by existing performance measure. Two of those identified by Bud Reeve and Brian Greger are equity and compatibility between land use and transportation. So we hope that this new measure will be able to at least address those two policy areas. And third, we want that this new measure to be able or to be easy to interpret and understand. Unlike the log sum measure, even though it's a good comprehensive composite measure, it's very hard to interpret for policymaker and to the public. And lastly, we hope that measure to be able to applicable to use case range from prioritization, scenario evaluation, to benchmarking, and to use as even use as a standard. So essentially cover a large range of application types. To just give you some idea of the applicability of performance measure or where we are targeting, essentially this is a chart or a table I took from the work done by Kitterson and the Association for the Washington County when they trying to select the multimodal performance measure and standards. Okay, so each row represents different scales, geographic scales largely. And our focus will largely on the transportation system or sub-area or corridor level, and trying to cover a full range of full type of applications from prioritization, comparison, scenario comparison, long-range benchmarking, and near-term standard or threshold. It will be we hope it can be used in other geography, but as I will mention that it's very difficult, especially because the data is hard to get from those lower or higher resolution geography. Okay? And they also mention their selection criteria when they narrow down the multimodal performance measure. I think the TCI, given our wish list, if we implement it well, it will satisfy all the selection criteria they listed here. Okay, with that explanation of the rationale, I trying to get into how we are going to do it, the implementation, the idea and the implementation of the transportation cost index. Even though we have not found a performance measure or a particular accessibility measure to our like, but we did find one that's a performance measure for a microeconomy, the so-called consumer price index, that's essentially fitting the bill that we, fitting all the criteria that we listed. As you may know, consumer price index essentially keep track or model the change in the price level for a basket of goods and service, a household purchase, by essentially two relatively straightforward steps. For one, they construct a basket of goods and service that household purchase or household needs. They essentially have 8 different categories for those basket. Those are predefined group in their basket, including housing, transportation being another major group in the basket. And then they just track the price level for all goods and service in the basket. Okay, and then weight those price level by the weights in the basket, and then we utilize that to as a index, as the CPI. So our idea would be if we can build an analogy of consumer price index to keep track of the transportation cost, what we call transportation cost index, it will essentially measure the change in the price level of a basket of trips and destination meeting the household needs to travel to for their daily needs. And then we can also do so by following two simple steps. For one is to identify a basket of trips and destination based on predefined group. Trip purpose will probably be one natural option. And then we just keep track of the time and monetary cost of accessing trips and destination, trips or destination in those baskets. Okay, so if we can implement that, I believe it will work as a comprehensive measure of transportation and land use because it captures both the travel component and where people are going. And will be able to serve as a performance measure for policy areas, including equity, because we can keep track of those costs by, say, different income groups or different other demographic characteristics as well. And we can use that to measure the transportation and land use compatibility and balance as well. Okay. It will be easy to interpret, given that most people, even though they may not be able to articulate what CPI is, what it does, but they can understand it as a measure of inflation. Okay. Similarly, the TCI will be able to, I believe, will be able to interpret it in a similar fashion. Okay, and if we will be able to build our TCI based on widely available data sources, it will be possible for essentially all the types of applications we just mentioned. Benchmarking and scenario evaluation and comparison being two prominent examples here. Even though the idea is, if it's short clarification question, yes, you can ask. Otherwise, the longer question, longer discussion, would prefer to leave to the end. Okay, great. So, in terms of, even though the idea is relatively simple, but we haven't found very good, solid foundations of how to construct a travel basket. We experiment two implementations at this point. The first one is a travel survey-based method that rely on inputs from household activity survey. One example being the Oregon Travel and Activity Survey that ODOT conducted in 2011 and 2012. And there are many other similar travel surveys across different regions. Even we have a nationwide national household travel survey in the same fashion. And for this implementation, we essentially construct a travel basket based on activity diary or a sample of trips or tours that are representative of the regional travel pattern. Potentially, we could track of those baskets by different trip purpose. Those household size and other characteristics will be able to will retain those information at household level, and then be able to summarize by those characteristics in there as well. And the second step will essentially just track those time and monetary cost of making those trips. Okay, we can keep track of the time duration, trip duration, or trip distance. And this application or this implementation was suitable for prioritization and benchmarking because we do have historical data, historical travel surveys that we can tap into for benchmarking. We can also potentially use those for prioritization of projects, essentially identify those subgroups or pockets of communities where they have or they're suffering a higher transportation costs. And the second implementation is based on a travel demand model that rely on inputs from a travel demand model which are generally available for most of the MPO, most of metropolitan planning organizations. And certainly ODOT and then other large MPOs certainly have their own in-house travel demand model. Okay, and theoretically, this implementation can calculate the transportation cost for every income group and then for every TAZ, although those are highly depend on what characteristic has been used in the travel demand model, because there's the input are purely or all the input are taken from the travel demand model. The advantage or the applicability for this implementation is that it will be suitable for scenario evaluation and comparison, because travel demand model, that's basically what travel demand model is for. It will be able to evaluate or simulate from different input scenarios and then spit out what the output or the end resulted travel time, travel flow will be. And we can utilize that to evaluate what the transportation cost index will be for future or for different scenarios. I will not get into a lot of details about the implementation for the travel demand model or for that matter the previous implementation, but we essentially utilize the distribution of say employment or other destinations across the region and identify activity centers and utilize those centers as our candidate for baskets. I want to briefly touch upon how we calculate transportation costs. And I promise this is the only equation you will see in this presentation. It's essentially just a way of saying that we keep track of the costs by different modes. Okay, we can keep track both of the time cost and monetary cost. So we have a constant that could be, for example, the fare, if it's a fixed fare transit system. And we have a cost that computed from the distance, which generally could be all the costs for driving. For example, the distance-based, VMT-based cost for driving. And then we have a time component that can be essentially captures the time cost. Okay, we can do the counting either in dollar, which will essentially require us to convert the time into monetary cost, time cost into a monetary unit. That generally can be done by using a parameter called value of time. That usually will have actually recommended by agencies like ODOT or actually even Federal Highway Administration. And we can also do the counting in minutes. Okay, essentially converting the monetary cost again by dividing the value of time so that we keep track of the travel cost in minutes. Okay, for essentially in our implementation, it's very easy to switch between the two. For the remaining of my presentation, I primarily show you the results measured in minutes because our impression, our assumption is that the time cost actually is the primary component of the travel cost, and measured in minutes make it easier to find problems, to find patterns in the data or in the results we're going to show you. Okay, that's the implementation. I will, for the remaining time, I will look into or show you a few applications of the TCI and demonstrate some of the applicability of TCI. So here's example of showing or comparing the transportation cost for Toulan in two different time points. Okay, 1994 and 2011. Those 2 years for which we have travel survey data. This is just only a travel survey-based approach, and then we show the distribution of transportation cost by different income category. So the solid line is low-income household, and the dashed line with smaller dash is middle income, and with longer dash is high income here. So what we can see from here is that the low-income household, largely the distribution of travel costs for low-income household are generally the same, but middle income and high income look like their costs move a little bit higher to the right. Okay. One thing I want to mention is that the y-axis here, even though it's labeled as confusingly as density, it's the probability density function. Okay, it's not the land use density or density of anything. It's a probability density. You can more or less rate it as the percentage, even though it's not exactly the same thing. But you can essentially translate this as, say, it's 0.7% or 1% of household with a travel cost of a certain value. Okay, so that is looking at the trend, and certainly we perceive that the household characteristic are likely influence the transportation cost. Here, looking at the transportation cost by the presence of children in the household, again by two different time periods. So what actually is pretty clear, although the line is pretty hard to see, in 94, that for household with children, it's centered or peaked at 50 minutes. And in 2011, that peak moved to 100 minutes. So there is a drastic increase in travel cost for households with children. And again, that another way to looking at the data is that household size certainly influenced the total household level travel cost. So we divided the total cost or the generalized cost by number of person in the household, and plot the data by the income level. Okay, so in 94, the per person generalized costs are for 3 different income groups are largely kind of overlaps. In 2011, that those costs for middle and high income household look like they move to the right or increase a little bit, not too much. And then we can also looking at those generalized costs by their trip purpose and income. Okay, so here again looking at home-based work trip, home-based shopping, home-based recreation, home-based other. 4 different income level. So the first box is the low-income household, middle-income, high-income, and similarly for home-based shopping, home-based recreation, and so on. Okay, so that we can see that the commuting trips certainly see their cost increased by at least expand by quite a bit, especially for middle and high income household. While those shopping and recreation trips, that the difference across different income level is a lot smaller than in other trip purpose. Okay, and that difference seemed to be stay more or less the same in 2011. And as I mentioned, that it is possible to adapt the same algorithm to essentially any other travel survey data. Here's an example of applying the method, the algorithm to the 2009 National Household Travel Survey data. We essentially compute the transportation cost for all households included in the National Household Travel Survey, and rank the costs by the median household travel costs, and highlight Portland. Portland essentially ranked probably the bottom third in terms of all the major metropolitan statistic area for all households on average. Of course, if we look at the low-income household alone, that Portland we're only looking at, say, comparative transportation costs for low-income household. That Portland pretty much ranked at a middle. So essentially, low-income household is a little bit worse off in Portland compared to average households. And I mentioned that one potential application is the scenario evaluation. And I'll show you one example of applying transportation cost index to evaluate scenarios. That we applied the transportation cost index to two scenarios, as well as the base year for data in Corvallis. Well, ideally, we want to apply it to Portland, given that is where we are, and it certainly have a lot more diversity in terms of travel modes and population and so on. But the Portland model, they have not retained some of the data we need for calculating transportation cost index. So this is why we shift to use the Corvallis data instead. The first thing that's interesting for the Corvallis data is that, as we see in the Portland data, the low-income households actually have a lower cost in Portland, at least according to the travel demand model results, is that in Corvallis, low-income households actually have a higher cost than middle and high-income households. So we see a peak for the solid line for low-income household. We see a peak in the high-value area, high travel cost period. And in 2009, in the modeled preferred scenario, that looked like the essentially eliminate that peak in lower value, essentially generally will lower the transportation costs for low-income household. That I will think will be a good development. Another scenario we evaluate is what they labeled as 2030 preferred scenario 1. Unfortunately, that scenario is very close, very similar to the preferred scenario. So essentially, according to the TCI, or actually for that matter in other measures, there isn't much difference between those two scenarios. But ideally, we will be able to utilize this TCI to be able to evaluate how those transportation costs, the distribution, and those numbers differ between those two, or actually three different scenarios. And we can look at the same distribution of generalized cost or transportation cost by trip purpose and income level. Similar box plot. Not get into detail here, given that I'm running a little bit behind. And as I mentioned, that in travel demand model, it's possible to calculate the cost for different locations, especially at TAZ level. Here we shows the transportation cost by different TAZs for the base year 2010 and the 2030 preferred scenario. One example that may show, one pattern that show up here is that those low-income households in the southeast corner of Corvallis, in that TAZ, it look like it will suffer a higher cost than the base year. Okay, so with that, I will switch to talk a bit about the essentially ongoing and future work for this project. That the TCI has been adopted by the accessibility indicator development team as one of the indicators for the Mosaic project, which is essentially implementation of least cost planning. Although Bud Reeve and Brian Greger should get all the credit for get the TCI notified and adopted by the IDT team. And we hope, in terms of future work, we certainly for that development, we certainly will be very interested to see the implement or working with them to implement and have the TCI implement actually applied in planning process across the state. Okay, so we'll be very interested in test TCI in public engagement and policy making process. Few remaining work or two remaining tasks will be to reconcile the TCI from the two different implementations. That their magnitude is very close, but they essentially use different data sources, use a slightly different methodology. So we are thinking whether there are needs to reconcile by a different approach so that their numbers will be closer. Okay, and lastly, to verify the pattern of transportation cost with information from alternative source, especially the monetary component, for example, from sources like consumer expenditure survey. And the project has been released as an open source project on GitHub, so you should be able to find all the source code we use following that URL. We have two, or actually a few working papers. Those two are what we presented at TRB last year and this year. And so we are pretty excited with this project, and we do think it is a valuable addition to the existing sets of accessibility measure. And we are certainly will be very interested to work anybody that's interested in knowing more, or actually hopefully interested in applying the TCI in, for that matter, anywhere. Finally, I would like to acknowledge our sponsors, National Institute of Transportation and Communities, and Oregon DOT. With that, I will close and open for questions. Thank you. Okay, questions? Yes?
I was curious how the housing and transportation actually measures accessibility if it's only measuring the monetary cost.
Right. That's a good question. It's probably not a exact, or at least not a classic accessibility measure per se, right? But it does capture some of the components, some of the elements of an accessibility measure. Accessibility measure generally trying to capture both the transportation and land use system features, characteristics of both systems. So the H plus T, they essentially at different location, when they calculate the monetary cost, they take into consideration the land use characteristics, including the density, the design, and the different land use mix at different neighborhood, at different community level, and then use that to model how much people will drive, what percentage will use transit instead, and then collapse those monetary costs into the monetary transportation component. It's only, as I also mentioned, the limitation for them as they are not capturing the kind of performance of the transportation system per se, except for the BMT and driving and transit share. So it's only lacks some of the elements. So essentially one of the one of the reasons that inspire our work. Okay, good question. Yes.
This might have been addressed earlier, but to capture the system performance of the transportation network, have you guys considered using node analysis, access node analysis, in order to incorporate that? Okay.
Node access. You mean what? Would you mind clarify what do you mean?
Oh, sure. So, like, if you're doing a geospatial analysis,
right.
you can see the number of node access nodes within the system, like
right.
for a bike network, for
right.
instance. And then you would then do some sort of density analysis.
Okay.
How many nodes are in
right.
a specific
right.
neighborhood, or
right. Okay, that makes sense. Now we have not specifically looking at the node access as a way to compute that. It will probably, I suppose, it will work very well for those modes that are not subject to the so-called capacity constraint. Means there is no congestion for bike, for walking, for pedestrian. Node analysis will be very helpful, but for driving or transit, because they may subject to congestions. A pure network analysis will not be able to capture the congested travel time. Okay, so we are essentially take those travel time from either a travel demand model or from a travel survey where those are reported travel time or approximate travel time that a traveler or the household actually experienced. So we essentially capture a more realistic travel time for those modes that are subject to congestion. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
So this kind of assumes that, in some sense, a minute equals a minute. And when I'm driving, I probably shouldn't be texting or reading.
Mm-hmm.
But when I'm on transit,
right.
I'm getting some use. It's not completely lost time.
Right.
Is there any way to accommodate that in thinking about this?
Yes, we do. We do capture that. It's a common, rather consensus that the value of time for different modes differs. So driving will have a different value of time, and transit will probably have another different value of time. There are existing research and report that documents at least the recommended value for the different value of time. So that's what we use. Okay, we essentially ODOT has a set of publication for the recommendation. Those are the number that we use for at least for the Oregon part of the data. Right, that's only a good point, and also that's something we are pretty happy that it's captured in the transportation cost index. Yes.
So for your applications, when you're showing your examples for Portland, is that just for the Portland city limits, the official limits of Portland itself, or is it the whole kind of metropolitan area?
Good point. It's more like the Portland metro, right?
So if you're in Hillsborough, Gresham.
Yes, essentially three-county area. I believe Clark County in Washington State is not it's not included here, but we could. We do have the data, I believe. Right.
Question.
Yes.
So when you're assembling the trips that you use in the basket, how do you evaluate the validity of the selection that you make? Like, what do you compare it to, and how do you say, oh, that's a great set of data, or that's a great set of trips, and that's totally not valid?
Very good question. We at this point we essentially make we're certainly looking at trying to eliminate some outliers, something that look purely wrong or actually does not make much sense. For example, in the original data, we believe, although I don't recall whether it's Portland data, but there are people essentially recorded a trip that originated from out of state. I forgot where, but it's kind of hundreds or thousands of miles in the reported travel diary. So for those, we certainly want to eliminate it. but because we're trying to capture at the daily basis what household, the travel pattern, travel costs, what household are. So it's only for those vacations, tourism, we probably don't want to be captured as part of the transportation costs calculation. But on the other hand, it's beyond some of those kind of threshold or selection criteria. It's very hard to know which one is a valid trip, which one is not.
Right.
We kind of essentially based our assumption on that they did a good job of selecting people participating in a travel survey. Hopefully those will be a representative group of people. They surveyed about 5,000 to 6,000 households in the Portland region. Over the state, it's more than 10,000 households. And those will essentially, they did some validation to see whether, in terms of the household characteristics, whether it's represented to the overall population. But it's very difficult to know whether the trip making, or on the other hand, largely the travel behavior captured in the travel diary or in the data set, in the travel survey data set, is representative, so to speak. There may be ways to, say, compare our Oregon or our Portland survey with National Household Travel Survey. May give us some sense, but National Household Travel Survey, they actually have few observations, few households for Portland. I believe it's close to 200 to 300. It's a small, much smaller sample. Right, it's hard because we just don't know. We don't have other data. On the other hand, it may be some comparison, for example, with 94 data. Essentially, at least we don't see a abnormal patterns when we compare those 2 years. So that at least to give us some confidence that they look like the trips or documented trip captured in a travel diary may actually work okay.
Okay, so you're comparing the output of the basket set to other data instead of a theoretical model, just so you can get kind of ballpark.
Okay, I probably misunderstood your question then. What we haven't done that part yet. We certainly could. Essentially captures or looking at at least in the monetary component, for example, compared to the H plus T, at least the T part, or the consumer expenditure survey to see whether that magnitude of the monetary cost for transportation from our TCI is in line with what captured in consumer expenditure survey. Supposedly that captures the monetary cost of transportation there. Okay, great. Good question. We might have 1 minute for one last question. Okay. Okay, but on the other hand, if there's no other questions, let's close and thank you.